everyone who's joining us in our session today on measuring the impact of social economy organizations, insights into innovative methods and digital tools. To start off with, I would hand over to my colleague Felipe.
Yes, thank you very much, Daniel. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Just in case that everything is working.
I can hear you.
Great. Yes. Also from my side, warm welcome and thank you very much for joining today's session. What did we bring to you for today? This is our agenda. We will briefly introduce ourselves and we will briefly introduce you to Main Level, our company we are working for, and then we are providing a little innovative platform for a little group introduction that Daniel will present later. And then the next agenda point basically deals with the following. The way we define social entrepreneurship will in the end affect the impact measurement, and it's really important here to have really like a common understanding where to draw the line between social entrepreneurship and other enterprises. And the same applies to the next bullet point, impact measurement. We basically need to have a common understanding what do we mean with social impact, and then we provide you with some methodological prerequisites, so to speak, for facilitating impact measurement in a very pragmatic way. And this will followed by a little input presentation by Daniel on how this impact measurement can also be facilitated by very user-friendly, intuitive digital tools that allows automized calculations, etc., when in terms of social impact measurement at a later stage. And then in the end, we're really looking forward to discussing with you your perceptions, your impressions, and your experience. And then let me start quickly with a brief introduction to who we are. We are Main Level Consulting. We are a company that basically provides expertise in two different fields. On the one hand, it's monitoring and evaluation, and on the other hand, it's digitalization and IT solutions. And most likely, many of you know that very often these two go hand in hand. Sometimes monitoring evaluation can be facilitated by digital solutions, etc. And the other way around as well. The way basically M&E is done in practice basically also affects the way we develop our IT solutions. We have worked with several different clients already and with different social actors already. So we are also quite familiar with measuring social impact. This is just like a little overview on some clients and beneficiaries we are working with. My name is Felipe. I'm one of the founders of Main Level Consulting and kind of married with the topic monitoring and evaluation my whole life, both academically and professionally. And I have been involved already in many impact measurements. And again, I'm really looking forward to discussing with you your experience so that we can also learn from you. And I hand over to my colleague, Daniel.
Thank you, Felipe. And again, welcome to everyone. Very excited and very grateful to have all of you in the room, in the virtual room with us this morning / early, noon almost. My name is Daniel. I'm a consultant with Main Level. I focus specifically on issues around digitalization and digital tools for monitoring, but also for sectoral approaches and under communication. And now, before we head into our session and to really deep dive into social impact measurement, we would actually very much like to learn a little bit more about you, who you are, so that we all can see who is actually in the room with us. Some of you may know the tool Mentimeter. To those of you who don't, please, in your browser or on your phone, go to www.menti.com and enter that code. I'm just going to briefly switch my screen now. You will, if you don't catch the code now, you will see the code in just a second. So please bear with me. Right. So if you go to menti.com, this is the code 73259915. Just going to give a minute for you to go there and enter the code, because then actually the first question we'd like to ask you is, please describe your current mood in one word.
Of course, if anyone has any problems with entering in the system, just send a quick message and we'll try to sort it out.
All right, I can see answers coming in. Curious, hopeful, excited, happy, exhausted.
Exhausted.
I hope that doesn't have to do with the weather. I don't know where you are based. I know we are all quite international. I can tell you, Felipe is based in Frankfurt. I'm based in Berlin. And May has decided to be more like March or April. So we've had not the greatest weather. But anyway, coming back to your mood, really happy to see that most of you are curious. We definitely second that sentiment. Excited, happy, good, hopeful. Some of you are tired, impatient, maybe with regards to monitoring, impact measurement. We'll see. Okay, let's move to the next one. I can see there's still answers coming in. All right, thank you. So the next question, which one of these roles best describes you? We just picked 4. Let's see if you can identify with them. Okay. All right, that is really interesting. So we've got a couple of social entrepreneurs, a few few participants working in the public sector, and a large number of you who are other interested persons. Actually, if you don't mind, you could just in the chat, so in the blue area on the right, just write briefly what sector or what role you basically come from, and then that will also give all of us an idea of who is in the room with us today. And Felipe, because I'm sharing my screen, I can't see that, but you should be able to view that right now.
We have a researcher. And there's a question, are all attendees automatically on mute?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, they are.
It says general and collective interest, private, it goes so quick. Private equity, impact investor.
Perfect.
Micro farming, event planner.
Great.
Social impact researcher, social entrepreneur, teacher.
Yeah.
Manager, business student.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Really diverse group. Very exciting. Next one. I've got 2 more questions to go. How would you rate your experience with impact measurement? From motivated beginner to somehow experienced to, well, being a seasoned expert. Okay. All right. So we seem to have quite an equal split between some of you being motivated beginners, others being already somehow experienced. Maybe you've already been dealing with impact measurement, monitoring, and we've got 2 seasoned experts. That's really good to know. Thank you. I'm going to swap over to the next slide, just so that we can also get started then with the next part of the presentation. But the next question is, how much do you agree with the following statements? My organization already uses impact measurement for institutional learning. And impact measurement is important for us, but we don't know where to start. Impact measurement sounds difficult and time-consuming. And here, this is really a rating question, so you can choose, on the left-hand side, you strongly disagree with the statement. On the right-hand side, you strongly agree with that statement. All right. Okay. So there's a few whose organizations are not using impact measurement. Quite a number who are, so equally split with regards to that. Okay, the majority, I would say, are unsure where exactly to start with it, and also an equal split between people thinking that it's difficult and time-consuming versus maybe not so much so. Okay. Great. With that, let's continue with our session. And once again, I'm going to quickly swap the screens. So bear with me for a second. All right. I hope you can see the screen, which should now show the introduction of the second part of our session.
Cool.
And handing over back to Felipe.
Yes, thank you very much, and also thank you for participating in our quick survey. As mentioned in the beginning, the way we define social entrepreneurship will in the end also affect the way we conduct or we do impact measurement. And at the same time, we also want to draw the line between the real social entrepreneurs and the entrepreneurs that do, we call it sometimes greenwashing, that sell basically each and every activity as green. But in the end are only, I would say, do not harm activities. So it's really important to have like a common understanding what does social enterprises or what does social entrepreneurship means. And one important aspect is, above all, that companies are created really with the intention to address a societal challenge or problem. For instance, such as poverty, healthcare, private education, you name it. So again, a key takeaway and key message is really a company that serves above all the purpose to address a certain societal challenge and problem. And in addition, social entrepreneurship also covers all measures and all activity and processes to enhance this social wealth by, for instance, creating new ventures or by managing existing organizations in an innovative manner. This is just as a start, so to speak. We will definitely dig a little bit into more detail later, but to make our methodological inputs later when it comes to monitoring, evaluation, and impact measurement, to make it a little bit more tangible, let us start with a few examples of social enterprises. So one example that we would like to show you is, for instance, Shoemates. The founder of Shoemates is from Afghanistan, and he developed this enterprise that basically follows the following vision or the following idea. Whenever he sells a pair of shoes, one kid in Afghanistan will get one shoe for free. So that means get one, give one. It's a classical social enterprise that strives for economic and financial sustainability. Another example is Discovering Hands. It's an enterprise that uses the superior sense of touch of blind or of visually impaired women and train them in a way that they can do a complementary form of diagnosis in early breast cancer detection for all age groups. For instance, in Germany, the mammography screening is only offered to women over the age of 50. That means preventive mammography is not provided before that time. Another example is, for instance, Grünschnitt, most likely very difficult to pronounce for many of you, but it's an enterprise that operates horticulture and landscape maintenance and only hires autistic and handicapped people and pays them market wages. This is just to provide you like few examples of social enterprises that we will later also refer to make our inputs later a little bit more tangible. So how do we define social enterprises? I'm quite sure that you are very familiar with the relationships that are presented on this slide. If an organization provides services and products to clients, to paying clients, then we are talking about enterprises. If an organization provides services to beneficiaries and often not paid, then we are talking about non-governmental organization or non-profit organization. And where do we locate now social enterprises? And social enterprises basically are always kind of determined by a so-called triangular relationship. So always three parties need to be involved so that we can talk about social enterprises. Here we have provided you three different forms of how we can define social enterprises. For instance, the first one, an organization is providing services or products to a paying client, and this client directly reaches beneficiaries. This is the example of shoemates, for instance. The organization develops and sells shoes, and through this, basically, kids in Afghanistan get shoes for free. Another example is when beneficiaries basically are working for an organization, for instance, providing or developing some products and services that the organization sells to clients. This is, for instance, the Grünschnitt example or the Discovering Hands examples. And the last example that we have here on the slide is kind of a more exceptional case, but nevertheless, we still count it under social enterprises. If beneficiaries develop or provide certain services or products to an organization, and through this organization, is the same group of beneficiaries are reached. For instance, homeless. If they develop a homeless newspaper, basically, and this will be given to other homeless, for instance, then we are also talking about social enterprises. And in the next slide, we have basically summarized it or visualized it in a very easy way. NGOs, basically, there is a direct connection and relationship with the beneficiaries. Enterprises are classically directly linked and connected with the clients. And social enterprises in the middle basically connects three different parties. In addition to the definition that we have provided you in the beginning of our presentation, and in addition now to the examples, there are 7 principles of a social enterprises developed by Professor Yunus that also can be taken as guidance to define social enterprises. And according to Professor Yunus, social enterprises, as mentioned also in the definition above, try to overcome at least 1, challenge, as mentioned. And the second bullet point is a very, very important one for social entrepreneurship. Social enterprises always strive for financial and economic sustainability. This is an aspect that we definitely will come later to and we'll discuss in more detail. But this is a very, very important aspect to be able to continuously address societal challenges. This is an important aspect. Social enterprises do not pay them profits, but the profits are used to finance expansion and to improve their services. So it's not about earning money and to put them in their own pocket, but the profit is used to improve the products and the services. Social enterprises are also determined by a very gender-sensitive and environmental conscious environment, so to speak. Definitely pays their employees, like Grünschnitt, the company who hires only autistic people, pays a fair market wage, and with Professor Yunus said, with better working conditions, but definitely with good working conditions. And last but not least, and they enjoy what they do. So basically, this understanding of social enterprise, of course, affects the way we design our impact measurement approach at the later stage. But this is what we presented you now is basically a state-of-the-art understanding of social entrepreneurship. Then, when it comes to impact measurement in social entrepreneurship, also here, we have to know what do we mean with social? What do we mean with impact? So in general, again, to start like with a very simple definition of what social impact is, it's first of all, the first dimension, it's the effect on the social fabric of a community or the well-being of individuals and families. But this is not the only dimension. It's also the dimension of how organization or people's action affect the surrounding community. So it's on the one hand, the actual effect on the well-being, but on the other hand, also the understanding of how, in order to replicate certain measures, and also to motivate other stakeholders in the environment. So this, to start with, this is a general definition of social impact. Now, what does M&E means? So impact measurement can take place in both in M and in E. And M&E stands for monitoring and evaluation. And especially in the public sector, M&E became so important because especially the public sector or the development cooperation sector, for instance, has to justify each and every money that they spend. So this is why the methodologies in terms of M&E are very robust. And according to many scientific papers, according also to the practice of many donor organizations, M&E comprise the following. On the one hand, monitoring. What does monitoring mean? We sometimes compare monitoring with a video. It's a kind of a management tool. It's a continuous observation on what has changed. But the focus is very often limited to certain indicators. Most likely you have heard the expression key performance indicators, for instance, and the monitoring system is basically used to intervene during the implementation. This is the M. Then we have the E. What does evaluation mean? In general, we sometimes compare it like with a photo, with a snapshot. It's definitely more a holistic approach of impact measurement by applying certain evaluation criteria. For instance, efficiency, effectiveness, sustainability, relevance, and impact. And then we have the so-called impact or theory-based evaluation. We sometimes compare it like with a microscope. So with these evaluation approaches or impact measurement approaches, we basically try to identify the net effect of an intervention. And here, and the particular methodological approach here is that we do not compare before and after. So the impact is basically the comparison between what happened before the intervention and after the intervention. But here we compare with what would have happened without the intervention. And this requires some complex statistical methods, basically, to simulate a so-called counterfactual. Again, this is just to give you like a brief overview. There's no need for you to remember all this right now, but just for our discussion right now, it helps that you once heard what M&E is about. Then, again, as mentioned, it's definitely important for the impact measurement how we define social entrepreneurs. Now, when we talk about social impact, it's also important how we define social, because this will also affect the way we do impact measurement. And there are two different views. One view is the so-called intrinsic motivation. So it says the moral value of an action is judged on the basis of the intrinsic motivation of the entrepreneur acting. That means only true believers act well and social. This is one way of interpreting social. The other one is consequences. This means the moral value of an action is judged on the basis of its consequences. Basically, the end justifies the mean. And also, very often, it's a combination of the two. If we want to develop an impact measurement design, we have to have clarity on how we want to define and interpret social. This is another key takeaway. Then we also need clarity on what does social impact mean. Also here we have two different views. The first view is the so-called static view. That means this social impact of an entrepreneur on a society through his, her services, products, and solutions at a certain point in time. The other view is the so-called dynamic view. It's the impact of an entrepreneur on a society, but by also motivating his or her environment to develop or offer solution with a higher social impact. And this is the currently dominating view when it comes to social impact. So social entrepreneurs really act as change agents with a greater impact on the society. And again, we need clarity on both. What is social impact? What is social entrepreneurship? Okay, the next slide, yes. As mentioned in the beginning, it's not only important if we achieved a social impact, but it's also important why we achieved the results. For instance, we have here the very simple example: a social entrepreneur develops a product, and hopefully in the end, beneficiaries benefit in the long run. But you can imagine this is an attribution gap. A lot of things happen in between before this happens, right? And to design or to develop an impact measurement design, it's really important to also identify the steps in between that are needed to achieve the end result in the end. So, for instance, let's assume the social entrepreneur develops a product. Let's say the shoemates example. It does not necessarily mean that the product is appreciated by a group of clients. It could be that we go online, take a look at the shoes, and that we don't like it, and that we don't buy it. And then in the end, no kid in Afghanistan will benefit from it. But even if we appreciate and say, you know what, it's a very good idea, it does not mean that we will buy it in the end. This is the next one. That means we also need to check whether this group of clients who also appreciated the product buys the product. But of course, again, our end result is that beneficiaries benefit in the long run. So it's probably more needed than a group of clients. So this is what we called in the M&E language copying. So even if a group of persons buy this product, it does not mean that other clients copy this behavior. And even if other clients copy this behavior, it does not necessarily mean that beneficiaries benefit from this interest, because in the end, we don't know how basically shoes will be transferred to kids in Afghanistan. And even if beneficiaries benefit from it in the short run, it does not necessarily mean that beneficiaries benefit in the long run. So you see a lot of question marks. And this also needs to be taken into account when designing or when developing an impact measurement design. And to make it even more complex, in reality, as you most likely know, reality is always much more complex. There are very often multiple objectives. There are definitely a high number of different inputs and also stakeholder involved. It's sometimes a very complex institutional environment. For instance, it's not always possible to register companies in certain countries immediately, etc. And what makes social impact very difficult to measure is that there are impacts in different sectors as well. So if we go to the next slide, you see there are like a lot of question marks. But the good news is now there are very pragmatic ways to basically to have a pragmatic way of doing impact measurement in practice, which we definitely would like to present you now. First of all, the first step, it's the next slide. The first step is really to structure your results. Its experience shows that you create a certain transparency when you structure your results according to different levels of results. There is a common standard to differentiate results according to outputs, outcomes, and impacts. What does it mean? Outputs basically represent goods and services that, as such, do not represent any benefits. They are only important prerequisites to achieve a benefit at a later stage. For instance, if we build a school, this is not a benefit. If no one goes into the school, then we just have the school without any benefits, but it's an important prerequisite. This is what we call the output. At the objectives or outcome level, basically, we allocate all desired results that have something to do with benefits for a certain target group, with changes in behavior, and with the use of the deliverables. And the goals and impact level basically is the long-term contribution of a project or an organization. So first step, main key takeaway, it makes sense all the desired results that a social entrepreneur wants to achieve, to just roughly allocate them to the different levels. Then the next step would be to develop a so-called theory of change. No worries, it looks complicated. I promise you it's not complicated. Again, as mentioned, it makes sense to identify, okay, what kind of outputs do I have? That means what kind of prerequisites do I have? And what kind of outcomes do I have? For instance, what kind of change in behavior do I want to achieve? What kind of benefit do I want to achieve? And then we have the impacts. saying like, okay, what is the overall contribution, or what are the overall goals that I want to contribute to? And then the second step would be to identify causalities between your desired results. Saying like, for instance, in this example, knowing, you know what, output 1 contributes to output 4, and output 2 directly contributes to outcome 1, meaning if output 1 is achieved, it's very likely that it will positively contribute to output 4. Or if you take a look at output 2, if we achieve output 2, it's very likely that it will positively contribute to outcome 1. This is basically a theory of change. It's based on common sense and also based on the experience of the entrepreneur, and also based on the experience of the sector, so to speak. Then the third step is to make these results measurable with the support of indicators. That means for all the outputs, output 1, output 2, output 3, output 4, and for the 3 outcomes and for the 2 impacts, we need at least 1 indicator. And it's very, very important that these indicators must be quantitative. So I'm pretty sure that you have heard many things about results indicators, process indicators, etc. Again, a very pragmatic way forward is just to focus on the formulation of indicators, and you might have already good indicators in the end. If, for instance, if you start formulating the indicator with number of indicators, definitely a good way forward to make the results in the theory of change measurable, or percentage of indicators, or perception indicators, saying like beneficiaries confirm the usefulness of the training, or classical is in place indicators. For instance, a law is in place, or a training institute is in place indicators, or time indicators. Time, for instance, to register a business, etc. So it's basically these are I would say the methodological prerequisites to make social impact tangible. Again, first of all, do a brainstorming, or the social entrepreneur needs to do a brainstorming about all the desired results. Cool. Then allocate it to different levels, to outputs, outcome, impact, for didactical reasons also. And then, second step, try to identify causalities. How are those desired results linked? How can I fill in gaps? Where do I need different objectives, maybe? And then make them measurable via indicators. And to give you, especially in the context of social impact, to give you some more example, we have in the next slide like a flow diagram to provide you with some examples. And no worries, there's no need for you to read now everything. I will guide you through it step by step. So the first column are the inputs. If we click one more. Yes. So with the inputs, basically, we describe everything what is needed in terms to conduct any kind of activities. The next column basically provides, as mentioned, the outputs. What do we offer? What does Shoemate really offer, etc.? And then basically it's about listing all what is needed in terms of deliverables to make a change in the end. It could be workshop, services, marketing campaigns, you name it. Then the second step would be how are the, one step back, how are these outputs used? How are the workshops used? How is the marketing campaign used, etc.? Then in the outputs column, we also have the participant satisfaction with the output. Before we have a change in behavior at a later stage, people need to be satisfied with it and accept it. Then we have the outcome level. That means, what do we really want to achieve? So again, all changes in behavior, all benefits can be allocated to this one. And an important aspect is number 5 here. The desirable changes in the action of the people have been reached. So we have a change in behavior. And last but not least, if we go to the last column, it's really the contribution to desirable social and economic changes. And I would just like to highlight one thing. These different steps can be further operationalized. For instance, especially when you consider changes in behavior, you might it's kind of logic that also psychological models can be applied. For instance, in the next slide, we would like to show you, for instance, if we have identified certain desired results in our theory of change model, how can we further operationalize these different results in the different pathways in the theory of change? For instance, when it comes to the change in behavior, yes, we made good experience with the so-called theory of planned behavior. So the theory of planned behavior claims to be the most robust psychological model in terms of explaining and anticipating changes in behavior. And according to this model, just very briefly, the change in behavior is determined by the intention to change the behavior. And the intention, in turn, is influenced by the so-called behavioral attitude. That means, do I expect positive consequences if I change my behavior? By the subjective norm, do important people for me consider this change in behavior also important? And the perceived behavioral control, do I feel skilled enough, enabled enough to do the change in behavior? And with this very intuitive and easy approach, there is a way to further enrich the impact measurement with very robust or empirically robust and intuitive models that can be operationalized in a questionnaire very easily. You only need 8 questions in a questionnaire, basically to anticipate a certain change in behavior. And this is basically just a quick overview about what are the first steps from a methodological point of view. And of course, this all can be facilitated by digital tools. And I hand over to my colleague, Daniel.
Thank you, Felipe. Now in the third part of our session, I'll be talking to you about how digital tools can actually support impact measurements, how they can facilitate supporting your monitoring of data and simplify that. And before I go into that, maybe just one aspect. If you may have already done so, but if you have questions, we of course have the Q&A in the end. And I know that the conference tool offers the Q&A option on the left-hand side. So please put your questions there, and we'll get to them at the end of our session. Now, talking about digital tools, to start with, I'd like to point out 4 aspects that are actually required for you to effectively and continuously measure your social impact. And that is firstly, that it has to be a continuous effort. That means it has to be something that becomes a routine, something that is done regularly. What that means is that it can't be something that's done ad hoc. You can't decide today that you need to collect data because next week you need to submit a report on your social impact. It has to be something that is done consistently over time so that you collect also the data accordingly over time. Secondly, it has to be a systematic process. What that means is that your monitoring processes and your routines need to be embedded within your team, within your organization. They need to be, or they should not be dependent on maybe this one person in your team that's very excited about M&E. Because if that person leaves, falls ill, or whatever may be the case, then your monitoring falls flat. So it needs to be, really the processes need to be embedded within your organization. And thirdly, of course, data only becomes valuable not just by itself, but when you turn it into information. and when you transform information. And the way you do that is by analyzing it, by reviewing it in the context of your work, and then using it for your decision making, for steering your project organization, and also for accountability purposes. And then last but not least, a very important aspect also is the user friendliness. So whatever monitoring system, whether it's a simple one or a more complex one, and I'll get to that just now, that system needs to be intuitive to use. It needs to be easy to use, easily accessible to everyone involved, so that all team members that benefit from it are also able to find timely information in that system. And our experience shows that digital tools can actually help you facilitate this, can make this quite a bit easier. Now, the question, of course, is how do you get started? Say, for example, your organization is new, completely new to social impact measurement and monitoring, or maybe still fairly new to monitoring impact management. Where do you start? And to kick things off, we'd like to outline 3 main goals that you should keep in mind, particularly if you're at the start of implementing a social impact measurement or monitoring process within your organization. And the first of these goals is that you should really start small with a simple monitoring system. Say, for example, your organization is new and you are very excited about monitoring, about getting started with it, maybe because you also have the backing of your boss, maybe you are the boss. And if that is the case, you should maybe not invest in the most sophisticated monitoring system to start with, which could cover every potential requirement in the future, but rather to start with something simple and focus on the basics. Make sure that the processes and routines when it comes to monitoring and M&E are actually in place within your team. And when that's the case, then you can start to grow your monitoring system, maybe expand to something more complex and advanced, which I'll give examples for also just now. Second goal is that you should really focus on creating a monitoring system that brings value to everyone in your team. So it's a monitoring system that, yes, your management will benefit from. Maybe it's your investors who will benefit from it. But it shouldn't just be for your management and your investors, should be for everyone in your team. And because our experience shows that this offers an opportunity, if you involve everyone in your team, or as many people as possible, in reviewing data from your monitoring system, it offers you the opportunity that you can then jointly assess where you're making progress, where you're on track, where you maybe have bottlenecks, and then jointly also see, okay, how do we need to adjust our product, our services, and the path or the steering of our organization, which can then in turn, of course, also help increase motivation within your team. And then after following those first 2 goals, you automatically almost come to the third one, which is that through that, you will establish, your third goal should be to establish a monitoring routine and a mindset in your team. Mindset, what does that mean in this context? It means really an understanding that doing monitoring, using a monitoring system is actually useful because myself as a team member, I see benefit in that. I see benefit from actually seeing the data on the progress of my activities, on the progress of customer or beneficiary satisfaction, whatever may be the case, whatever you may be monitoring. So that is the third goal, to really establish a monitoring routine and a mindset. Now, we'd like to outline really 6 steps to take with your team to kickstart a simple monitoring system. And these steps mirror in a way what Felipe has already mentioned in the second part of our session. And that is really, as a first step, to start and define, map out your objectives, your goals, your outputs as part of a theory of change. As Felipe mentioned, these results exist at different levels. At the top with the impact, you may have your overall vision as an organization, as a social business. At the bottom, you may have your outputs, your activities, your products, your services. And then in the middle, of course, with the outcomes, the changes in behavior and attitude and so on that you would like to achieve. And really by mapping that out, by defining the causalities, you create your theory of change. Our experience has been with projects that it can make sense to do that exercise in the first step with a small core group of people in your organization to create a first draft, then expand it, involve everyone in that, review the theory of change with your team, specify it further, and then what Felipe also mentioned, once you've done that, to really then look if maybe you have a lot of results that are interconnected and you realize these are too many to be monitored all, to really pick those that are most important to you. And then those results become then the ones that you define indicators for, which this is an example from the flowchart that Felipe showed earlier that was under outputs, participant satisfaction with the outputs. And the question, of course, for defining indicators is, in this case, how do you measure satisfaction? And going with the examples to make this really tangible and more or less easy that Felipe mentioned, could the answer to that question really points you to your indicator. For example, in this case, the number of customers that confirm satisfaction as good or very good on a scale from 1 to 5, for example. And then, you have a baseline, which is essentially your starting point, and a target, which is the aim that you want to achieve and that you want to actually measure. And if you want to become more advanced with defining indicators, you can look at what smart indicators means. You will find, if you look for that on the internet, quite a few guides that give you really, useful instructions how to make indicators that are specific, that you can measure, that are actually achievable, realistic, and time-bound. Now, once you've done that, you need to set up a simple method for collecting your data. And really, if your organization, particularly if your organization that you're working with, that you're working for, that you're part of maybe, or that you're consulting, maybe from a research perspective or from a consultancy perspective, if that organization is new to monitoring, our recommendation from our experience would be that you really start by building on tools that the team of that organization is already using. For example, what we found was that organizations that we've consulted in the past have been using the Microsoft Office 365 suite, and were then setting up an Excel-based monitoring sheet that was then centrally accessible to everyone in the team who had to use it, who needed access to it. And that was a good starting point, to get the processes right, to define your results, define your indicators, and all the respective information that you need. And there's a few more that I will point out, just now. The advantage of starting with or building an initial simple monitoring system based on tools that the organization or your organization is already using, the advantage of that is that it will keep your initial focus on really the point that I mentioned earlier, namely to establish a monitoring routine, to establish a monitoring mindset, before you expand and spend a lot of time on learning to use, implementing some new tool, some more sophisticated tool. Then once you've done that, it's really about distributing and defining clear roles and responsibilities when it comes to monitoring. You need to decide and define together who will collect data, when will the data be collected, what data needs to be collected, and you need to do that for each of your indicators. And that then becomes what we call a monitoring plan. This is just like a simple schematic table, just to show, if we go with the example for customer satisfaction, you would set a baseline and a target that you want to reach, and then you need to define, okay, how will it be measured? The data source. For example, will it be surveys? Will it be online surveys that you will ask clients to fill in? Or will it be paper-based surveys? Whichever may be the case. How often will it be measured? So what's the frequency? Do you need to run these surveys quarterly, or every half a year, or on an annual basis? And then, of course, who's responsible for collecting the data? If you do online service, it may be an external service provider that you're using. If you do paper-based surveys, maybe, somewhere in the countryside, you need to get data enumerators. All these kind of things you would define here. And then one more recommendation in this regard would be that you should then also consider nominating an M&E officer. This could be someone who takes this on, if you're at the start of this, who takes this on as an additional role to what she or he is currently doing. But the more complex your monitoring system actually gets, you will soon realize that you may need to have an extra position, a dedicated M&E officer. Now, once you've done all that, you can actually kick off your data collection. And congratulations, because you've come to a point where everyone in your team knows when to collect what type of data. Your team is ready to kick it off, and just go with it. Just try it out. And then after you've done that for a while, then comes the sixth and crucial step, really, and that is to review and to jointly analyze the data that you have collected. And there, again, just 3 recommendations from our experience that are good practice and valuable to do. Firstly, that you should think about institutionalizing review processes regularly within your team, to review and jointly analyze the data on the achievement of your indicators, for instance. Maybe as a standing item in your team meetings. I mean, if you have monthly team meetings, you may want to do it maybe quarterly, but really the point here is to also institutionalize it in that way, the review with the team. And a second recommendation would be that you then, based on those reviews, but also within management and so on, you use this information for learning with your team, learning in terms of where we're making progress, and in line with the targets that we set for ourselves and for our work. Where do we maybe identify bottlenecks or things that are not working according to plan, and then to really look at how do we need to steer the organization accordingly. And then last but not least, a third important recommendation from our point of view is that you should report your result. You should not just keep those results from your monitoring to yourself, or to your management, to your team, but also consider reporting them to your customers, to your clients, to your beneficiaries. And why we recommend that is because through that you can increase your credibility as an organization. You can almost position yourself as an accountable organization. Right, so those are the 6 steps to set up a simple initial monitoring system. Now, say you've done that, right? You've put in place a simple M&E monitoring system. You've collected data maybe for a year, maybe for a year and a half, and a simple M&E system is useful, as I said earlier, to start with, but it can become easily quite overwhelmed. And for example, if you use an Excel-based tool, you will also see limitations to that. For example, if you want to, include external data sources, maybe you have a very decentralized team where it can become a little bit tricky with Excel. Maybe you need more powerful data analytics or more sophisticated dependencies between the different types of data that you're collecting. And then another aspect relates to user permission, where, of course, with a simple tool, for example, an Excel-based tools, you also have limitations. Now, that is why we see, at least with organizations that for which the monitoring becomes more complex and whose monitoring needs become more advanced, we see a tendency to move towards web-based systems, or what we would call now in our case management information systems, or MIS. And there's really 5 key advantages that such systems bring. Firstly, you've got one platform with remote access that can be easily accessed by teams, wherever your team sits, as long as your team member has access to the internet and either a tablet, mobile device, or of course a laptop. It can facilitate and help you with more complex data collection methods than a simple tool such as an Excel sheet. For example, mobile data entry, you can integrate it with external data sources, you can add geodata. I mean, the options are almost limitless in terms of what can be added here to facilitate your data collection. You normally have dashboards that can help you with more advanced data analysis than Excel could do it, and not just more advanced, but also more automated data analysis, almost interactive data analysis. It helps you with reporting on your data. And last but not least, the point that I mentioned before, user permissions for accessing data and your data analyses are also much more the possibilities to have these different user permissions is something that you have with a web-based or MIS system, and something that you don't really have with an Excel tool, or at least not, can make it really complicated if you use Excel. So in the following, I'd like to show you just examples from an MIS that we've now developed for one of the projects we're consulting. And this particular project is a project in Afghanistan that works in challenging circumstances. They have to steer the project remotely due to security reasons and also COVID restrictions. But yeah, I mean, the context doesn't really matter that much. It's more about showing you how these different aspects and advantages could look in an MIS, in a web-based tool. Of course, there's many other tools out there as well from other service providers, and we'll mention a few of them towards the end. Now, firstly, of course, what I already mentioned is in terms of data collection, what we find is that an MIS can really facilitate and make data collection easier through user-friendly templates. It can offer you sort of complex ways to create linkages between data sets. For example, in this case, I don't know if you can see it, but you can choose, you have almost selections that you can choose from that are pre-given in terms of villages and categories and so on. And that really also helps you with your data consistency and data quality, which is something that can quite easily become a bit tricky when you use Excel. In terms of analysis, what we find is that there's usually two levels of analysis that we are looking at, and that an MIS can also help you with and facilitate. One is an analysis, data collection and analysis on an operational level. So with regards to all the data that you're collecting related to your activities, to your services, to your outputs. I mean, this project, as an example, was monitoring natural disasters, jobs that were created, innovative measures that were created, and also training courses. And then based on these activities, you then can have also individual dashboards that are filterable and so on. The second level relates to now, mentioned again, but very important, indicators. So you can really view progress on indicators that you've predefined. And then the advantage of such a web-based system is that you can that you can see the progress and the status of these indicators based on the operational data that has been entered by you, by your team, by your partners into the system automatically. And of course, you know, these things look different with different web-based solutions. In our case, you have now the different attributes that are being measured, such as numbers of villagers that are trained and the percentage of those who are female. And then you can really see, you know, whether you are on target or below target. In terms of reporting, yes, such a system can also help you with allowing you to download, for example, diagrams, maybe even predefined aspects of a report. All data can, if you need it as an Excel, of course, be downloaded as well. And then last but not least, the very important point around user permissions, because you may want to give data collectors, data providers, different permission to access and use such a system than, say, your staff, your M&E officer, your management, and so on. And this is something that you can only do with a more complex tool normally. I don't even know if this is possible with Excel, to be honest, maybe with permissions to access the sheet as such, but then it becomes quite limiting. Now, looking at the time, wrapping up the session just now, but basically, yeah, this turns into like a neat circle of like 5 aspects, from data collection to analysis on 2 levels, reporting and user permissions, that are all sort of key advantages that we at least see bring benefits to organizations such as yours or the ones you're working with using a web-based tool. But then, of course, the question becomes, how do you know whether you need a web-based tool? I mean, initially we said you should start small. Where do you start if you want to actually implement and utilize a more sophisticated web-based monitoring tool within your organization or the organization you're working for? And how do you know when to start? And there's really 2 questions that you can ask yourself. The first question is, the 6 steps that we mentioned earlier to kickstart monitoring, especially if you're new to it, have those steps been implemented well? So are the basics in place? Is a process in place for monitoring? Are routines in place? Does your team have a mindset for monitoring and also see the benefit in it and wants to continue it and actually expand it? Yes? Okay, great. Second question, is the simple tool that you're currently using has it become insufficient? Maybe because, like I said earlier, you have a decentralized team, you need more advanced data collection, maybe data import, integration features, and so on. Yes, well, then you may actually benefit from using a web-based tool. And also here we've got two recommendations. The first really is, don't just, our recommendation would be, before you buy a large-scale sophisticated web-based tool to use, to consider investing first into a small digital concept. And the reason for that is, why you should do that, because it's quite a small effort. From our experience, it's normally not more than 10 working days of a service provider to produce such a digital concept for you that will help you understand your project needs, your system features that you would need, user requirements for such a web-based monitoring system, and so on. And this will then really help you to inform your decision on what system to go for, what system to procure, what web-based system. When it comes to procurement, there's really the procurement of web-based systems. There are many reputable service providers out there, just like a small selections of those that we know. I mean, there's SmartMe, for example. There is WebMo, which uses a wiki-based approach. There's Tola Data, and yes, of course, there's also us. We also have an MIS solution that we've tailored, implemented for many clients, and also in the public sector and non-profit sector, with M&E support surrounding that. And yeah, so really, I mean, we can quite confidently say that with such a digital concept, and that you will be able to procure a web-based system that will be able to add benefit to you, to your organization, to your teams, when it comes to monitoring, and then measuring your impact as an organization. And before you run off, we would actually like to offer you help and support with getting started with this. And what we would like to do is, we would like to offer you coffee for M&E advice. What do we mean with that? Well, just a free, completely, no strings attached, 1 hour session to discuss your impact measurement needs and to share advice that we can give you on how to get it started. When would we do that? When could we do that? Well, we have 4 1-hour sessions that we could offer you throughout June. And if you are interested, just write Felipe and myself an email, just briefly outline your organization's need for setting up a monitoring system for impact measurement, for instance. And then, we'd really be happy and looking forward to having such a virtual coffee with you. No worries if you prefer tea. Tea is also fine. And with that, I would actually like to close the third session on the third part of our session on digital tools and move over to the Q&A. But before we do that, I would just briefly like to ask you to, one more time, quickly jump back to Mentimeter. If you still have it open on your phone, just go back to the same one that you've opened before. It will continue. If not, here's the URL and the code. And I'm just going to switch my screen quickly. You will see the code again in just a minute. So just be with me. Right. Okay, so one more question to ask around statements and how much you agree with them. How much do you agree with these statements now? Measuring social impact doesn't sound all that difficult. We can do it. I know how to start setting up monitoring systems for social activities. Digital tools could help us simplify the measurement of social impact. And then fourthly, I've actually already come across good monitoring systems in social entrepreneurship. All right. Okay. Great. So quite a number of you are actually motivated and also optimistic about measuring your social impact, that you can do it. But no worries if you are unsure about it. This is not it's not magic, it can seem a little bit daunting, especially when you're at the start, but, with the steps that we've outlined and with some extra support, if you're interested, like I said, please write us about the coffee for M&E. We'll help you get started. Great. And there's a few of you who've come across good monitoring systems, but the majority probably not yet. Well, hopefully in the future now also with your knowledge, also with some support, you would be able to support either your organization or an organization that you're working with to institutionalize such a system. Now, second question, just for us to know, because we'd be quite interested, would you be interested in having such an M&E coffee? Mm-hmm. Okay. Great. All right. Good amount of interest. That's also really good to know, Felipe, for both you and I. And we look forward to hearing from you and to having those 4 coffee chats. Great. Then let me stop sharing my screen, and we will actually move over to the Q&A. The only thing I'm going to do is I will share the screen with our contact details, and so that you know how to contact us. Okay, so yeah, time to hear from you. But yeah, our contact details, and now let's look into the Q&A, and I'm just going to open it. Yeah. All right. So I can see I can currently see one question in the Q&A section. If you have any other questions, please feel free to also use the blue chat on the right-hand side, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. We have about 17 minutes left. So maybe starting with the question from Mehdi. Thank you. I would like to know your vision about the difference between the social entrepreneurship, social and solidaire economy. Mehdi, Felipe, I don't know. I'm not sure if I understand what you mean with the solidaire economy. If you could maybe just outline.
Me neither. I didn't come across the solidaire economy.
Yeah. Well, let me check, Mehdi, if you're still in the room. I think I can quickly ask you to give you broadcast permission. That should enable you to turn on your microphone, and then you can maybe just quickly explain what you mean. So, Mehdi, you should be able to unmute yourself now and just maybe quickly outline what you mean, and then we can answer your question. Okay, maybe in the meantime, I can see the question from Miriam. How can we get access to the presentation? I uploaded the presentation to the content material of this session. Now, Mehdi, now I can see you. Mehdi? Okay. Well, how to access the presentation? I uploaded it to the content section, but I am not 100% sure if you have accessed that. Sorry, this is also the first time that I'm using this system that I'm using for OISIS. So if you want the presentation, please also just write us an email. You should still be seeing the screen with our contact details. Feel free to drop Felipe or myself an email, and we'll share it with you via PDF. I think that's the easiest. Okay, Raphael, I can see you're writing. You can't see it. Yeah. Sorry, just write us an email. We will send it to you as soon as we receive your email. Sandra is writing, a lot of social enterprises are now where is it? Are now working with traditional companies in specific projects. For example, capsule collections. Do you have systems for these kind of projects?
Capsule collections. Do you know what it means, Daniel?
I'm not exactly sure, Sandra. So I'm also going to give you broadcast permission. So if you're still with us and can hear us, please feel free to unmute yourself, and you can just briefly explain, and then Felipe and I will answer.
Maybe then to address Konstantin's question, setting up the M&E is one thing.
Now I can see Sandra. Yes, please.
Good morning. For example, there are fashion companies that are working with social enterprises in little projects, for example, a capsule collection, or other companies, for example, big supermarkets. They do specific projects, but I never see evaluation about on this project. There are a lot of I don't know. It seems social washing or greenwashing. You work with a social enterprise. You do something of social or benevol, but I never see impact measurement on this. Maybe they are mixed system, because we have two systems that in one moment, one project, they work together. So I am asking you if you developed some tools on this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your comment. And this is our experience. Especially monitoring and evaluation is often seen as additional burden to companies, to enterprises, and this is why many enterprises, organizations distance themselves from monitoring and evaluation efforts. And on the other hand, sometimes it's really like the lacking knowledge of having a pragmatic approach. And in today's session, we definitely wanted to take away the fear of doing monitoring and evaluation. And this already covers Konstantin's comment asking, yes, it's definitely not super easy when it comes to identifying KPIs. But again, M&E can be done very pragmatic and should be hands-on. For instance, again, a brainstorming session on desired results is a first step. You don't need to be an M&E expert. Then the next step is really to identify how are the results somehow linked with each other. Second step. And then to make them measurable, I know if you Google indicators, there are really numerous publications on indicators. If you just follow the formulation advice that we have given to you, you're definitely on a good way to have indicators that fulfill the so-called SMART criteria. And in the end of the day, an indicator is nothing else than a common understanding. It's a common understanding of how a group of persons want to measure something. For instance, if I want to measure whether Ronaldo is a good football player, what are my indicators? The number of goals that he shoots in each game? Or is it the number of dribblings that he does every time? So basically, there's no right or wrong. It's just a common understanding of how to operationalize the results. And by basically applying those formulations that we have presented to you, you are definitely on a good way forward to have the KPIs. And the same applies to why many organizations do not do M&E. It's really about where to start. And hopefully the session today gave at least like a little hint of where to start from.
Thanks, Sandra, for the question, and also thanks, Felipe. I can see one more question in the Q&A section. Please, could you give the examples of which indicators of impact work best and worst for your experience? So examples for impact indicators.
Yes. Again, there are different levels of results. We have the output level, the outcome, and the impact level. When we talk about impact measurement, and this is maybe confusing, impact measurement does not mean that we are only focusing on the impact level. Impact measurement means that we really try to measure the contribution to achieving the results, either on output level, on the lower level, on the mid level, the outcome level, or on the impact level. So there is no one good example, because it really depends on what kind of contribution I want to measure and to which results I want to measure. For instance, if we want to measure a change in behavior, then, for instance, the theory of planned behavior that we have presented can be a good approach to operationalize it. And again, when formulating or using the formulation advice that we have presented to you, you are definitely on a good way forward. For instance, if you want to measure happiness, if you start with either the formulations number of, percentage of, or perception. For instance, if you start formulating in a way, number of person who smiled twice a day, perfect indicator for happiness. I mean, of course, there's probably most likely many other things that can be allocated to happiness, but this is just an example how to approach it.
Thank you. Thanks for the question, and thank you, Felipe. I can see there's two questions, one by Raphael, and Mehdi just clarified something. Maybe just because I think it ties a little bit into what we just discussed, Raphael's question. In developing indicators, does main level work primarily or solely with internal enterprise decision-making stakeholders, or does the process of developing indicators also involve beneficiaries and what do you call them? Parentheses? Sorry. Does it also involve beneficiaries, clients, or more broadly the community? I think this is a really, really crucial question. Thank you, Raphael. Felipe.
Yes, both. We're working with the decision makers, both in the private sector and in the political sector, but also with beneficiaries. Again, and this is what we also wanted to highlight in the beginning. It's so important to have a common understanding. If, for instance, decision makers do have a different understanding on impact than beneficiaries, then basically impact measurement becomes obsolete. So it's definitely important to do some pre-assessments and to really have a common understanding on what we want to measure and what is really a benefit. We have mentioned the wordings, the words benefit, change in behavior, in a way that it looks very simple. In practice, of course, it's not super simple to identify what are really benefits or what is really a change in behavior. But again, this needs to be reflected both by the beneficiaries and by the decision makers to have a common understanding. So yes, we collaborate with both.
And I would even complement that to your question, Raphael, to say, the more you can involve also the community you're working with, your beneficiaries or clients also in developing indicators and your results, the better, because it can help you also gain clarity on the relevance of the results that you're defining and so on. So also from our experience, consulting organizations in defining their results and the indicators, yes, I mean many of them do it not just as like an internal exercise, but also involving people, partners, beneficiaries they are working with.
Yes, and then the comment from Mehdi.
Yes.
Yes. Of course, there are like many gray zones and many overlapping. I mean, like social economy is basically, it's basically the diversity of enterprises, different stakeholders, organizations, corporations, associations, etc. And it's kind of an open membership. You can participate or you cannot participate, but they definitely aim for making a social change. While the solidarity economy is also addressing social changes, also aims for profitability, but the governance structure is a little bit different. So it's a very participatory and democratic governance structure in which decisions are taken together for a societal change. This is the way I understand it.
Thanks, Felipe. Mehdi, I hope that answered your question. There was a brief question from Gisela about what KPI means. KPI refers to key performance indicators. Those you often find also in the sort of corporate sector, for example. That's why we mentioned earlier in our presentation that maybe that's something that you would have heard of when it comes to indicators, KPIs. Whereas indicators, when you work in a public sector, or as we do also with international cooperation organizations and projects, indicators there would refer to something else. What all indicators share is that they make a certain result measurable, whether it's a KPI or whether it's a different kind of indicator. Thank you, Giovanni. Really glad to hear that. And Hillary, just see, hey, question about qualitative reporting techniques. Soft outcomes are harder to reflect, yet as important as quantitative reports on impact and outputs. Any suggestions how qualitative impacts could best be measured? Thank you.
Yes, our recommendation is if you have access to beneficiaries and to a large group of stakeholders, it's always recommendable also to do a quantitative analysis, because you can transfer all qualitative information in a quantitative variable. For instance, satisfaction, happiness, change in behavior. You can transfer it kind of very easily. However, qualitative reporting techniques are also very important. Nevertheless, they can never claim to be representative, but they can provide a much more detailed picture into certain aspects. And this is why we always recommend to triangulate both qualitative and quantitative techniques. And the qualitative, basically, there are many techniques that can be applied in practice. And our big recommendation is really to, when do qualitative reporting, also to ensure that there is a common understanding on terminology, etc. So, for instance, if you conduct an interview and if you ask very openly a beneficiary whether he or she benefited from something, it should be more concrete, so that at the end results can be comparable. And there are like many techniques, like think aloud techniques or whatever, to kind of minimize the bias that can happen. Or when you conduct focus group discussions, the way the focus group leader basically should conduct the focus group discussion should also follow some rules. But this is really like another topic.
All right. Thank you, Bodo. Any more questions? I see it's 1 minute before 1, so we are pretty much almost up with our time. I'm just checking. There's one more. Okay, one more question in the chat from Nagaswara. Thanks for the wonderful session. May I know any short-term research, fellowship, or grants in the area of social entrepreneurship? Okay, if there's someone amongst you and the other participants who know, please type in the chat. I have to admit I am not aware of it, but that's also because I'm not active in that research fellowship space myself. Okay, I think it's 1 p.m. In terms of the program. Well, we would like to thank you all for joining our session. We would also like to thank you for all the questions that you've asked and for your participation and for staying until the end of our 1.5-hour workshop. And again, if you have any further questions, you have our contact details, please, or if you would like to get in touch about something, do write us. Also, if you are interested in receiving a PDF version of our presentation and about the M&E coffee. And on that note, thank you again. Have a wonderful rest of the OISIS Summit. We look forward to hearing from some of you.